Hassan-i Sabbah, scholar, revolutionary, the old man of the mountain. He created something the world had never seen before, a secret order that changed the nature of power itself. This is his story. To understand the man who would reshape the politics of the medieval world, we must first understand the world into which he was born. The 11th century was a time of tremendous change across the Islamic lands. Great empires rose and fell. Religious movements clashed in ways both violent and philosophical, and ordinary people found themselves caught between powerful forces they could barely comprehend. Let us begin by painting a picture of this world. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the vast stretches of land from the shores of the Mediterranean Sea all the way to the borders of India and China. This was the Islamic world of the 11th century. It was not one unified empire, though it had been in earlier times. Instead, it was a patchwork of kingdoms, sultanates and caliphates, all connected by a common faith, but divided by politics, ethnicity, and competing interpretations of that faith. At the centre of this world, at least symbolically, sat the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. The Abbasid caliphs had ruled the Islamic world since the year 750, when they had overthrown the Umayyad dynasty in a bloody revolution. For centuries they had presided over what historians now call the Islamic Golden Age. This was a period of remarkable achievement in science, mathematics, philosophy, medicine, and the arts. Baghdad itself had grown into one of the largest and most magnificent cities on earth. Its house of wisdom attracted scholars from across the known world. Greek philosophical texts were translated into Arabic. Indian mathematical concepts, including the number 0, spread westward. Astronomers mapped the stars with unprecedented precision. Physicians wrote medical encyclopedias that would be studied in Europe for centuries to come. But by the time Hassan-i Sabbah was born, around the year 1050, the glory days of the Abbasid Caliphate were fading. The caliphs still sat on their thrones in Baghdad. They still commanded respect as the nominal leaders of Sunni Islam, but real power had slipped from their hands. They had become figureheads, puppets controlled by military strongmen who held the actual reins of government. The most important of these strongmen in Hassan's time were the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuks were a nomadic people who had migrated from the steppes of Central Asia. They had converted to Sunni Islam and had gradually built up their military power until in 1055, just a few years after Hassan's birth, they marched into Baghdad and took control of the caliphate. The Seljuk leader took the title of Sultan, meaning holder of power. The caliph remained as a religious figurehead, but the Sultan made all the real decisions. The Seljuk Empire quickly expanded to become one of the largest powers in the region. At its height, it stretched from the borders of China in the east to the edges of the Byzantine Empire in the west. The Seljuks were fierce warriors, skilled horsemen who had learned the arts of war on the open steppes. They brought a new energy to the Islamic world, but they also brought instability. Their empire was constantly troubled by succession disputes, rebellions, and conflicts with neighbouring powers. Now, to understand Hassan-i Sabbah and the movement he would eventually lead, we must also understand the great religious divide that split the Islamic world. This was the divide between Sunni and Shia Muslims. It is a division that began in the earliest days of Islam and continues to this day. So let us take some time to explain it clearly. When the Prophet Muhammad died in the year 632, he left behind a community of believers, but no clear instructions about who should lead them after his death. This created an immediate crisis. Some believed that leadership should pass to the most capable and respected member of the community, chosen by consensus. Others believed that leadership should remain within the Prophet's own family, specifically passing to his cousin and son-in-law, Ali ibn Abi Talib. Those who supported choosing a leader by consensus eventually became known as Sunnis, from the Arabic word sunnah, meaning tradition or custom. Those who believed Ali should have been the immediate successor became known as Shia, from Shiat Ali, meaning the party of Ali. In the immediate aftermath of Muhammad's death, the consensus faction won out. The first three caliphs, Abu Bakr, Umar and Uthman, were all chosen from among the Prophet's companions rather than his family. Ali did eventually become the fourth caliph, but his reign was troubled by civil war. He was assassinated in 661, and power passed to the Umayyad dynasty, who were not descended from the Prophet. For the Shia, this was a great injustice. They believed that the rightful leadership of the Muslim community had been stolen from the Prophet's family. This sense of injustice only deepened with the events of 680, when Ali's son Hussein led a small band of followers against the Umayyad Caliph Yazid. Hussein and his followers were massacred at the Battle of Karbala, an event that became central to Shia identity. Every year, Shia Muslims commemorate this tragedy during the mourning period of Ashura. Over the centuries, the Shia developed their own distinct religious traditions, legal schools, and theological doctrines. Central to Shia belief was the concept of the Imam. For Shia Muslims, the Imam was not just a political leader, but a spiritual guide, divinely appointed and possessing special knowledge and authority. The Imams were the descendants of Ali and Fatima, the Prophet's daughter. They were believed to be infallible in matters of religion and to possess esoteric knowledge passed down from the Prophet himself. But here is where things become more complicated, and this complication is essential for understanding Hassan-i Sabbah. The Shia themselves split into different groups over the question of which descendants of Ali were the true Imams. The largest group, known as the Twelvers, believed in a line of 12 Imams. They held that the 12th Imam had gone into hiding, or occultation, in the 9th century, and would one day return as the Mahdi, a messianic figure who would establish justice on earth. But another group, the Ismailis, had a different view. The split occurred over the succession to the 6th Imam, Jafar al-Sadiq, who died in 765. Most Shia followed his younger son, Musa al-Kazim, and his descendants. But some believed that the true Imam was Jafar's elder son, Ismail, or Ismail's son Muhammad. These followers became known as Ismailis, or Seveners, because they recognized a different line of 7 visible Imams. The Ismailis developed their own distinctive beliefs and practices. They placed great emphasis on the hidden esoteric meanings of religious texts. They believed that the Quran and Islamic law had both an outer, apparent meaning and an inner, hidden meaning that could only be understood through proper spiritual guidance. This esoteric approach gave Ismailism a mystical quality that attracted many followers. By the 10th century, the Ismailis had achieved something remarkable. They had established their own caliphate, the Fatimid Caliphate, based in Egypt. The Fatimid caliphs claimed descent from Ali and Fatima through the Ismaili line of Imams. They ruled over a wealthy and powerful empire that included Egypt, North Africa, Sicily, and parts of the Levant. Their capital, Cairo, became one of the great cities of the medieval world. They founded Al-Azhar, which would become one of the most prestigious centres of Islamic learning. The existence of the Fatimid Caliphate meant that by the 11th century, the Islamic world had 2 competing caliphates. In Baghdad, the Abbasid Caliph represented Sunni Islam, though real power lay with the Seljuk sultans. In Cairo, the Fatimid Caliph represented Ismaili Shia Islam. The two were bitter rivals, each claiming to be the true leader of the Muslim world. This rivalry played out not just on battlefields, but in a war of ideas and propaganda. The Fatimids developed a sophisticated missionary network. They trained agents called dais, a word meaning summoner or caller, who travelled throughout the Islamic world, spreading Ismaili teachings and recruiting new followers. These dais operated secretly in Sunni-controlled territories, building underground networks of believers who looked to Cairo for spiritual and political guidance. It was into this divided, complex and often violent world that Hassan-i Sabbah was born. The great powers of his age, the Seljuk sultans and the Fatimid caliphs, were locked in a struggle for dominance. Religious differences mapped onto political conflicts. Secret missionaries spread forbidden teachings in the shadows, and ordinary people searched for meaning and justice in a world that often seemed to offer neither. The stage was set for the emergence of a man who would challenge the existing order in ways no one could have predicted. A man who would take the tools of secret organization and religious devotion and forge them into something entirely new. A man who would build a state within a state, a fortress of faith in the mountains, and send out agents whose very name would become synonymous with political murder. But before he became the old man of the mountain, before he captured Alamut, before he founded the Order of the Assassins, Hassan-i Sabbah was simply a boy growing up in a Persian city, learning his letters and his prayers, with no idea of the destiny that awaited him. The city of Qum lies in the heart of the Persian plateau, surrounded by desert and mountains. Even today, it remains one of the holiest cities in Shia Islam, home to the shrine of Fatima al-Masuma, sister of the 8th Imam. Pilgrims have travelled there for over 1,000 years to pay their respects and seek blessings. In the 11th century, when Hassan-i Sabbah was born, Qum was already a centre of Shia learning and devotion, a place where the faith burned bright even under Sunni political domination. It was here, around the year 1050, that Hassan came into the world. We must say around, because the exact date of his birth is not recorded in any surviving source. Medieval chroniclers were often more interested in the deeds of great men than in the precise details of their births. What we do know comes from fragments, from later accounts, and from Hassan's own autobiographical statements that were preserved by later historians. Hassan's father was named Ali, a common name among Shia Muslims honouring the first Imam. The family belonged to the Twelver Shia tradition, the largest branch of Shia Islam, which recognised 12 Imams descended from Ali and Fatima. This was the mainstream form of Shiism in Persia, and it would have shaped Hassan's earliest religious education and worldview. The family claimed Arab ancestry, tracing their lineage back to Yemen in the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula. Whether this claim was literally true or simply a matter of family tradition and pride, we cannot say with certainty. What matters is that it placed the family within the broader community of Arab Muslims who had settled in Persia after the Islamic conquests. These Arab settlers had intermarried with the local Persian population over the centuries, creating a blended culture that was both Islamic and Persian. Young Hassan would have grown up speaking Persian, the language of everyday life in the region, but he would also have learned Arabic, the language of the Quran, of religious scholarship, and of high culture throughout the Islamic world. A proper religious education in those days required mastery of Arabic, for how else could one read the Holy Book in its original form, or study the great works of Islamic jurisprudence and theology? We can imagine the young Hassan sitting cross-legged on a carpet in some modest room, learning to recite the Quran under the guidance of a teacher. He would have memorized verses, learned the rules of proper recitation, and begun to absorb the vast body of religious knowledge that formed the foundation of Islamic learning. This was the standard education for boys of his social class, the education that would prepare them for lives as scholars, merchants, or administrators. But Hassan was not an ordinary student. Even in these early years, he showed signs of exceptional intelligence and an intense questioning mind. He had a gift for learning, a capacity to absorb and retain information that set him apart from his peers. He also had something else, something harder to define, a hunger, a restlessness, a sense that there must be more to understand, more to discover, deeper truths waiting to be uncovered. The religious atmosphere of Qom would have nurtured this hunger. Shia Islam, with its emphasis on the hidden imam and the expectation of his eventual return, naturally cultivated a sense of mystery and anticipation. The Twelver Shia believed that the 12th Imam, Muhammad al-Mahdi, had gone into occultation in the 9th century. He was still alive, hidden from the world, and would one day return to establish justice and righteousness. This belief gave Shia Islam a messianic quality, a sense that history was moving toward a great culmination, that the apparent injustices of the present world would eventually be set right. For a young man of intellectual gifts and spiritual sensitivity, this was heady stuff. The world was not simply what it appeared to be. There were hidden dimensions, concealed truths, a divine plan working itself out beneath the surface of events. This way of thinking, this openness to hidden meanings and esoteric knowledge, would prove crucial to Hassan's later development. At some point during Hassan's youth, the family moved from Qom to the city of Ray. Ray was one of the great cities of medieval Persia, located near the site of modern Tehran. It was larger and more cosmopolitan than Qom, a centre of trade and learning where different ideas and traditions mingled. The move may have been motivated by economic opportunity, or perhaps by the desire to provide young Hassan with access to better educational resources. Whatever the reason, it would prove to be a turning point in his life. Ray in the 11th century was a city of considerable importance. It had ancient roots going back to pre-Islamic times and had served as a capital for various Persian dynasties. Under Islamic rule, it had become a major centre of commerce and culture. Caravans passed through on the great trade routes, connecting east and west. Scholars gathered in its mosques and madrasas, and, importantly for our story, it was a place where different religious ideas circulated and competed. The young Hassan continued his education in Ray, studying the religious sciences that were expected of a promising young man of his background. He learned Islamic jurisprudence, the complex body of law derived from the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet. He studied theology, grappling with questions about the nature of God, the problem of evil, and the relationship between faith and reason. He read philosophy, encountering the ideas of Greek thinkers like Aristotle and Plato as they had been transmitted and developed by Muslim philosophers. It was a rigorous intellectual training, and Hassan excelled at it. He had a sharp, analytical mind that could cut through complicated arguments and identify their essential points. He had a remarkable memory that allowed him to retain vast amounts of information, and he had a gift for debate, for marshalling evidence and constructing persuasive cases for his positions. But alongside this formal education, Hassan was also being shaped by the informal influences of his environment. Ray was a city where Sunnis and Shias lived side by side, not always peacefully. The Seljuk rulers were Sunni, and they favoured their own sect, but they could not simply eliminate the substantial Shia population. Instead, there was an uneasy coexistence, punctuated by occasional outbreaks of sectarian violence. For a young Shia man like Hassan, this situation was a constant reminder of the minority status of his community. The Shia were the underdogs, the oppressed, the ones whose rightful leaders had been martyred and whose true imams had been forced into hiding. This sense of grievance, of historical injustice, was woven into the fabric of Shia identity. It would have been part of Hassan's consciousness from his earliest years. At the same time, Hassan was becoming aware of the diversity within Shia Islam itself. The Twelver tradition in which he had been raised was not the only form of Shi'ism. There were other groups, other interpretations, other claims to truth. And one of these alternative traditions was about to enter Hassan's life and change it forever. The Ismailis, as we have discussed, were a distinct branch of Shia Islam with their own line of imams and their own esoteric teachings. They had established the powerful Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt, but they also maintained networks of missionaries and believers throughout the Islamic world, including in Persia. These Ismaili communities operated largely in secret, for they were considered heretics by both Sunni authorities and mainstream Twelver Shias. In Ray, the Ismailis had a presence, though a hidden one. Their missionaries, the Dais, worked quietly, identifying promising individuals and gradually introducing them to Ismaili teachings. They were skilled at this work, patient and persuasive, able to appeal to both the intellect and the emotions of their potential converts. It was in this context that Hassan had an encounter that would alter the course of his life. He met a man named Amir Darab, who was an Ismaili Dai operating in Ray. The meeting may have seemed casual at first, perhaps a conversation in a mosque or a marketplace. But Amir Darab had an eye for talent, and he quickly recognized in Hassan a young man of exceptional ability and spiritual hunger. The Dai began to engage Hassan in conversation, probing his beliefs, challenging his assumptions, hinting at deeper truths that lay beyond the conventional teachings Hassan had received. This was the standard method of Ismaili missionary work. They did not simply announce their doctrines openly. Instead, they led potential converts through a gradual process of questioning and discovery, allowing them to feel that they were uncovering hidden knowledge rather than simply being told what to believe. For Hassan, these conversations were electrifying. Here was someone who spoke of mysteries beyond the ordinary understanding, who claimed access to esoteric knowledge passed down from the imams themselves. The Ismaili worldview, with its emphasis on hidden meanings and spiritual hierarchies, appealed to something deep in Hassan's nature. It offered answers to questions he had been asking all his life. It promised a path to truth that went beyond the surface of things. But Hassan did not convert immediately. He was too intelligent, too cautious, too well trained in the methods of religious argument to accept new ideas without careful examination. He questioned Amir Darab closely, demanding evidence and explanations. He compared Ismaili teachings with what he had learned in his Twelver upbringing. He wrestled with doubts and objections. This period of questioning and internal struggle lasted for some time. Hassan later described it as a time of great turmoil, when his old certainties crumbled but new ones had not yet taken their place. He fell ill during this period, and he interpreted his illness as a sign from God, a punishment for his hesitation in accepting the truth. When he recovered, his doubts had resolved themselves. He was ready to embrace the Ismaili faith. The conversion of Hassan-i Sabbah to Ismailism was a pivotal moment in history, though no one could have known it at the time. It set him on a path that would lead to Alamut, to the founding of a new religious and political movement, to a legacy that would echo through the centuries. But all of that lay in the future. For now, Hassan was simply a young convert, eager to learn more about his new faith and to serve the cause he had embraced. His Ismaili teachers recognized his exceptional qualities and began to train him more intensively. He learned the esoteric doctrines that lay at the heart of Ismaili belief. He studied the techniques of missionary work, the art of persuading others and bringing them to the truth. He was being prepared for a role as a da'i himself, an agent of the Ismaili cause. The exact timeline of these events is difficult to establish with precision. Medieval sources give varying accounts, and Hassan's own autobiographical statements, as preserved by later writers, are not always consistent, but the broad outlines are clear. By his late teens or early 20s, Hassan had converted to Ismailism and had begun his training as a missionary. He was about to embark on a journey that would take him across the Islamic world and eventually bring him back to Persia with a mission that would shake the foundations of the established order. The transformation of Hassan-i Sabbah from a promising young Twelver Shia scholar into a committed Ismaili revolutionary did not happen overnight. It was a gradual process, marked by intellectual struggle, spiritual searching, and ultimately a profound reorientation of his entire worldview. To understand this transformation, we must look more closely at what the Ismailis offered that proved so compelling to a mind like Hassan's. The Ismaili faith, as Hassan encountered it through his conversations with Amir Darab and other teachers, was built on a foundation of esoteric interpretation. The Ismailis believed that religious truth operated on multiple levels. There was the Zahir, the outer or apparent meaning of scripture and law, which was accessible to ordinary believers. But beneath this surface lay the Batan, the inner or hidden meaning, which could only be understood by those who had received proper spiritual guidance. This distinction between outer and inner truth gave Ismailism a powerful appeal to intellectually curious individuals. It suggested that the apparent contradictions and difficulties in religious texts were not flaws, but features. They were puzzles waiting to be solved, veils concealing deeper realities. For someone like Hassan, who had spent his youth studying religious texts and grappling with theological questions, this was an intoxicating idea. It promised that his intellectual efforts were not in vain, that there were indeed answers to the questions that troubled him, if only he could find the right teachers. The Ismailis also offered a clear hierarchy of spiritual authority. At the apex of this hierarchy stood the Imam, the living descendant of Ali and Fatima, who possessed divine guidance and infallible knowledge. Unlike the 12 Ashaya, who believed their 12th Imam had gone into hiding, the Ismailis claimed that their Imam was present and accessible, ruling over the Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo. This meant that believers could have a direct connection to divinely guided leadership, not through memories and traditions of the past, but through a living, breathing authority in the present. Below the Imam were ranks of teachers and missionaries, each with their own level of knowledge and responsibility. The dais who spread the faith were part of this hierarchy, and becoming a dai meant joining an elite corps of spiritual warriors fighting for the truth. For an ambitious young man like Hassan, this offered not just intellectual satisfaction, but a sense of purpose and belonging. He could be part of something larger than himself, a movement with cosmic significance. The process of Hassan's conversion, as he later described it, involved a period of intense inner conflict. His 12 Shia upbringing had taught him to be suspicious of the Ismailis, who were often portrayed as dangerous heretics. The Ismaili claim that the Fatimid Caliph was the true Imam contradicted everything Hassan had learned about the line of Imams. To accept Ismailism meant rejecting the beliefs of his family and community, a step that could not be taken lightly. Hassan wrestled with these issues for months, perhaps years. He engaged in debates with Amir Darab and other Ismaili teachers, raising objections and demanding answers. He compared Ismaili doctrines with 12 teachings, looking for weaknesses and inconsistencies. He prayed and reflected, seeking guidance from God. The illness that struck Hassan during this period was interpreted by him as a divine intervention. Lying sick, perhaps feverish and delirious, he felt that God was punishing him for his hesitation. He had been shown the truth, and he was refusing to accept it out of pride and attachment to his old beliefs. When he recovered, his resistance had broken. He was ready to submit to the Ismaili faith and to dedicate his life to its service. Once Hassan had made his commitment, he threw himself into his new faith with characteristic intensity. He was not content to be a passive believer. He wanted to understand everything, to master every aspect of Ismaili doctrine and practice. His teachers recognized his exceptional abilities and gave him increasingly advanced instruction. He learned the techniques of talim, the Ismaili method of authoritative teaching that emphasized the necessity of a divinely guided instructor. He studied the complex cosmology that the Ismailis had developed, with its emanations and spiritual hierarchies. He absorbed the history of the Ismaili movement, from its origins in the disputes over the succession to Imam Jafar al-Sadiq to the triumphant establishment of the Fatimid Caliphate. But Hassan's education was not purely theoretical. He was also being trained in the practical arts of missionary work. A successful Da'i needed to be able to read people, to identify their needs and concerns, to find the right approach for each potential convert. Some people were motivated by intellectual curiosity, others by spiritual longing, still others by political grievances. A skilled Da'i could speak to all of these motivations, adapting his message to his audience while maintaining fidelity to the core truths of the faith. Hassan proved to be extraordinarily talented at this work. He had a penetrating intelligence that allowed him to quickly grasp the essence of any argument or situation. He had a gift for language, for finding exactly the right words to persuade and inspire, and he had an intensity, a burning conviction that made his words carry weight. When Hassan spoke about the truth of Ismailism, people listened. His superiors in the Ismaili hierarchy took note of this promising young recruit. Word of his abilities reached higher levels of the organization, and eventually it was decided that Hassan should be sent to Cairo, the heart of the Ismaili world, to continue his education and to meet the Fatimid Caliph Imam himself. This was an extraordinary honor. Cairo was the capital of the Fatimid Caliphate, a city of legendary wealth and sophistication. The Fatimid court was one of the most splendid in the world, and the Caliph was revered by Ismailis everywhere as the living Imam, the divinely guided leader of the faithful. To be summoned to Cairo was to be recognized as someone of exceptional promise, someone who might play an important role in the future of the movement. Before we follow Hassan on his journey to Egypt, let us pause to consider what kind of man he had become by this point in his life. He was probably in his mid-20s, though the exact dates are uncertain. He had received an excellent education in both the traditional Islamic sciences and the esoteric teachings of Ismailism. He had demonstrated exceptional intellectual abilities and a talent for persuasion. He had also shown a capacity for total commitment, a willingness to dedicate himself completely to a cause he believed in. But there were also darker qualities emerging in Hassan's character. He could be rigid and uncompromising, intolerant of disagreement or dissent. He had a tendency to see the world in black and white terms, with little room for nuance or ambiguity. Those who agreed with him were friends and allies. Those who disagreed were enemies, obstacles to be overcome or eliminated. This absolutism would serve him well in some ways, giving him the strength to pursue his goals with unwavering determination. But it would also lead to terrible consequences, to acts of violence and cruelty that would stain his legacy. For now, however, Hassan was simply a young man setting out on the adventure of a lifetime. He was leaving Persia, the only home he had ever known, to travel to the legendary city of Cairo. He was going to meet the Imam, to stand in the presence of divine guidance made flesh. Whatever doubts or fears he may have felt, they were overwhelmed by anticipation and excitement. The future stretched before him, full of possibility. The journey from Persia to Egypt was long and arduous, covering thousands of miles across some of the most challenging terrain in the medieval world. Hassan would have travelled by caravan, joining groups of merchants, pilgrims, and other travellers who banded together for safety and companionship. The roads were dangerous, threatened by bandits, harsh weather, and the simple difficulties of finding food and water in remote areas. But for Hassan, the journey was also an education. He passed through lands he had only read about, saw cities and peoples he had only heard described. He crossed the great deserts of Arabia, where the sun beat down mercilessly and water was more precious than gold. He visited holy sites, perhaps stopping at Mecca and Medina to perform the pilgrimage that was the duty of every Muslim. He observed the diversity of the Islamic world, the different customs and traditions that flourished under the broad umbrella of the faith. Throughout his travels, Hassan remained alert to opportunities for missionary work. Every conversation was a chance to assess a potential convert, to plant seeds of doubt about conventional beliefs, to hint at deeper truths waiting to be discovered. This was the life of a Dai, always working, always seeking to expand the circle of believers. When Hassan finally arrived in Egypt, he must have been overwhelmed by what he saw. Cairo in the late 11th century was one of the great cities of the world, a metropolis of perhaps 500,000 people, far larger than any city in Europe at the time. The Fatimid caliphs had lavished resources on their capital, building magnificent mosques, palaces, and public buildings. The city was a centre of trade, with goods flowing in from across Africa, Asia, and Europe. It was also a centre of learning, home to Al-Azhar, the great mosque and university that the Fatimids had founded. For an Ismaili believer, Cairo was something more than just a great city. It was the seat of the Imam, the place where divine guidance was made manifest in the world. The Fatimid Caliph was not merely a political ruler, but a spiritual leader, the latest in the line of Imams stretching back to Ali and the Prophet himself. To be in Cairo was to be at the centre of the universe, spiritually speaking. Hassan was received with honour by the Ismaili leadership in Cairo. His reputation had preceded him, and the authorities were eager to meet this promising young Persian who had shown such exceptional abilities. He was given access to the highest levels of the movement, allowed to study with the most learned teachers, and eventually granted an audience with the Caliph himself. The Fatimid Caliph at this time was Al-Mustansir, who had reigned since 1036 and would continue to reign until 1094, one of the longest reigns in Islamic history. Al-Mustansir was a complex figure, presiding over a caliphate that was past its peak but still formidable. During his reign, the Fatimid Empire faced numerous challenges, including military defeats, economic difficulties, and internal power struggles. But he remained the Imam for Ismaili believers, and his authority in spiritual matters was unquestioned. What passed between Hassan and the Caliph during their meeting we do not know in detail, but the encounter clearly made a deep impression on Hassan. Here was the living Imam, the bearer of divine light, the guide who could lead humanity to salvation. Whatever doubts or questions Hassan may have harboured were resolved in the presence of this authority. His commitment to the Ismaili cause was confirmed and strengthened. Hassan remained in Cairo for several years, continuing his education and becoming increasingly involved in the inner workings of the Ismaili movement. He studied at Al-Azhar, absorbing the vast stores of knowledge accumulated there. He learned about the administration of the Fatimid state, the complex bureaucracy that governed the empire. He made connections with other Ismaili leaders, building a network of relationships that would serve him well in the years to come. But Hassan's time in Cairo was not entirely smooth. He became embroiled in a dispute that would have far-reaching consequences. The issue was the succession to the caliphate, a question that would eventually split the Ismaili movement itself. Caliph al-Mustansir had many sons, and the question of which one would succeed him was a matter of intense interest and intrigue. The most powerful figure at the Fatimid court was a military commander named Badr al-Jamali, who had effectively taken control of the government and reduced the caliph to a figurehead. Badr al-Jamali favoured one of al-Mustansir's younger sons, al-Mustali, as the next caliph. But many Ismailis, including Hassan, believed that the succession should go to the eldest son, Nizar, in accordance with the principle that the imamate passed to the eldest male heir. This was not merely a political dispute. For Ismailis, the identity of the imam was a matter of supreme religious importance. The imam was the divinely guided leader, the source of authoritative teaching, the link between humanity and God. To follow the wrong imam was to cut oneself off from divine guidance entirely. The stakes could not have been higher. Hassan became a vocal supporter of Nizar's claim. He argued passionately that the succession must follow the proper line, that Nizar was the rightful heir and future imam. This position put him at odds with the powerful faction at court that supported al-Mustali. The conflict grew heated, and eventually Hassan found himself in a dangerous position. Some sources suggest he was imprisoned for a time. Others say he was simply expelled from Egypt. What is certain is that his time in Cairo came to an end under a cloud. The exact circumstances of Hassan's departure from Egypt are obscured by the passage of time and the biases of different sources. Some accounts portray him as a troublemaker who was justly punished for his insubordination. Others present him as a principled defender of the true succession who was persecuted by corrupt courtiers. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Hassan was undoubtedly sincere in his beliefs about the succession, but he was also ambitious and perhaps not always diplomatic in how he expressed his views. Whatever the precise details, Hassan left Egypt around 1081, after spending approximately 3 years in the Fatimid capital. He was now in his early 30s, a mature man with extensive education and experience, but he was also a man without a clear place in the world. He had alienated the leadership in Cairo, the centre of Ismaili power. He could not return to his old life in Persia as if nothing had happened. He needed to find a new path forward. The years that followed were years of wandering. Hassan travelled extensively throughout the Islamic world, visiting different regions and communities. He went to Syria, where there were significant Ismaili populations. He may have travelled to other parts of the Middle East as well. Throughout these journeys he continued his work as a da'i, spreading Ismaili teachings and recruiting new believers. But Hassan was also thinking, planning, developing a vision for the future. His experiences in Cairo had taught him important lessons. He had seen how the Fatimid Caliphate, for all its grandeur, was weakened by internal divisions and dependent on military strongmen. He had observed how the question of succession could tear a movement apart, and he had begun to formulate ideas about how to build something different, something stronger, something that could survive and thrive even in hostile territory. The key insight that emerged from Hassan's reflections was the importance of territory. The Ismaili missionaries had achieved remarkable success in spreading their faith across the Islamic world. There were Ismaili communities in Persia, Syria, Yemen, and many other places, but these communities were vulnerable. They lived under Sunni rulers who could persecute them at will. They had no secure base, no place where they could practice their faith openly and organize their movements without fear. What the Ismailis needed, Hassan concluded, was a stronghold, a place that could be defended against enemies, a base from which to operate and expand. This idea would become the guiding principle of Hassan's life work. He would spend the next decade searching for the right location and preparing the ground for what would become one of the most remarkable political experiments in medieval history. Around the year 1081, Hassan-i Sabbah returned to his homeland of Persia. He was no longer the young student who had left years before. He was now a seasoned missionary, a man who had seen the heart of the Ismaili world and had developed his own ideas about how the movement should proceed. He came back with a mission, though the full scope of that mission would only become clear over time. Persia in the 1080s was firmly under Seljuk control. The great Sultan Malik Shah ruled over a vast empire stretching from Central Asia to the borders of Egypt. His vizier, Nizam al-Mulk, was one of the most capable administrators of the medieval period, a man who had created an efficient bureaucracy and patronized learning and culture. The Seljuk state was Sunni, and it viewed Ismaili missionaries as dangerous subversives who threatened the religious and political order. For Hassan, this meant that his work had to be conducted in secret. He could not openly preach Ismaili doctrines or organize Ismaili communities. Instead, he had to work underground, identifying potential converts through careful observation, approaching them cautiously, and gradually introducing them to the faith. It was dangerous work. Discovery could mean imprisonment or death. But Hassan was well suited to this kind of clandestine activity. He had been trained in the arts of persuasion and recruitment. He knew how to read people, how to identify their vulnerabilities and aspirations, how to present the Ismaili message in ways that would resonate with different audiences. He was patient, willing to spend months or even years cultivating a single convert if that convert was valuable enough. Hassan travelled throughout Persia during this period, visiting different cities and regions. He spent time in Isfahan, the Seljuk capital, a magnificent city that rivaled Baghdad in its splendour. He visited other urban centres, building networks of supporters and sympathisers. He also began to pay attention to the rural areas and the mountainous regions that lay beyond the easy reach of Seljuk authority. The geography of Persia was crucial to Hassan's plans. The country was not a uniform plain that could be easily controlled from a single centre. Instead, it was a land of dramatic contrasts. There were fertile valleys and barren deserts, gentle hills and towering mountains. The Alborz mountain range in the north formed a formidable barrier between the Persian plateau and the Caspian Sea. The Zagros Mountains in the west separated Persia from Mesopotamia. These mountainous regions were difficult to access and even more difficult to control. They had always been refuges for those who wished to escape the power of lowland rulers. Hassan began to focus his attention on the Alborz Mountains, particularly the region known as Dailam. This was a rugged, isolated area with a long history of independence. The people of Dailam had resisted Arab conquest for centuries after the initial Islamic expansion. They had their own traditions and their own fierce pride. Even now, under nominal Seljuk rule, they maintained a degree of autonomy that was rare in the empire. The Dailam region was also home to a significant Shia population. Many of the local people followed various forms of Shia Islam, and some had already been converted to Ismailism by earlier missionaries. This meant that Hassan would not be starting from scratch. There was already a foundation of sympathisers and believers on which he could build. As Hassan explored the region, his attention was drawn to a particular fortress. It was called Alamut, a name that would become legendary in the years to come. The fortress sat atop a rocky outcrop in the heart of the Alborz Mountains, overlooking a fertile valley below. It was virtually impregnable, accessible only by a single narrow path that could be easily defended. The castle had been built centuries earlier and had passed through various hands over the years. At the time Hassan first saw it, it was held by a local ruler loyal to the Seljuks. Hassan immediately recognised the strategic potential of Alamut. Here was exactly the kind of stronghold he had been seeking. A place that could be defended against any army, a base from which to organise and expand the Ismaili movement, a symbol of defiance against the Seljuk order. If he could capture Alamut, he would have the foundation for everything he hoped to achieve. But capturing a fortress was no simple matter. Hassan had no army, no military force that could storm the walls and overwhelm the defenders. He would have to use other methods. He would have to be clever, patient, and willing to play a long game. Hassan began by intensifying his missionary work in the region around Alamut. He converted villagers in the valley below the fortress. He recruited supporters among the garrison of the castle itself. Slowly, methodically, he built up a network of believers who were loyal to him and to the Ismaili cause. He was infiltrating the fortress from within, creating a fifth column that would open the gates when the time was right. This process took years. Hassan was not in a hurry. He understood that lasting success required careful preparation. He continued to travel, to preach, to organise. He maintained contact with Ismaili communities throughout Persia and beyond. He was building something larger than a single fortress, a movement that would eventually challenge the mightiest powers of the age. During this period, Hassan also refined his religious and political ideas. He developed a distinctive interpretation of Ismaili doctrine that emphasized the absolute authority of the Imam and the duty of believers to obey without question. He created organizational structures that would allow the movement to function effectively even under persecution. He thought carefully about the use of violence as a political tool, developing ideas that would later shock and fascinate the world. The question of violence deserves some attention here, for it would become central to Hassan's legacy. The Ismaili movement, like many religious and political movements, had always faced the challenge of how to deal with enemies who were more powerful. The Fatimid Caliphate had conventional military forces, but these were far away in Egypt and could not protect Ismaili communities in Persia. Local Ismailis were vulnerable to persecution by Seljuk authorities, and they had no way to fight back through conventional means. Hassan began to develop an alternative approach. If the Ismailis could not defeat their enemies in open battle, they could strike at them in other ways. They could target key individuals, the leaders and decision-makers whose deaths would throw enemy forces into confusion. A single, well-placed killing could achieve more than 1,000 soldiers on a battlefield. This was the logic that would eventually give rise to the Order of the Assassins, but we are getting ahead of ourselves. In the 1080s, Hassan was still preparing the ground. The dramatic events that would make his name famous throughout the world were still to come. For now, he was a secret missionary, working patiently in the shadows, building the foundations of a revolutionary movement. The years passed. Hassan's network grew. More and more of the garrison at Alamut converted to Ismailism. The local population in the surrounding valleys became increasingly sympathetic to the cause. Everything was moving toward a climax, though the outside world remained largely unaware of what was brewing in the mountains of northern Persia. By 1090, Hassan judged that the time was right. He had spent nearly a decade preparing for this moment. He had hundreds of supporters in and around Alamut. The fortress was ripe for the taking. All that remained was to execute the plan. The fortress of Alamut occupied one of the most dramatic settings imaginable. Picture a narrow valley cutting through the Alborz mountains, with steep cliffs rising on either side. At one end of this valley, a massive rock formation jutted up from the valley floor, its sides almost vertical, its summit flat and defensible. On top of this natural citadel sat the castle, its walls seeming to grow organically from the stone beneath. The name Alamut has been interpreted in various ways. Some say it means eagle's nest, a fitting name for a fortress perched so high above the surrounding landscape. Others derive it from a local legend about an eagle that led an ancient king to this spot. Whatever the true etymology, the name captured something essential about the place. It was a fortress that seemed to belong to the sky rather than the earth, a place where eagles might indeed make their home. The castle itself was not especially large. It could not house a great army or store supplies for a prolonged siege. But it did not need to. Its strength lay in its position. Any attacking force would have to climb the narrow path that wound up the rock face, exposed to missiles and rocks from the defenders above. A handful of determined men could hold Alamut against thousands. The fortress had been built centuries earlier, probably during the Sasanian period, before the Islamic conquest. It had been expanded and modified over the years, passing through the hands of various local rulers. By the late 11th century, it was held by a man named Mahdi, who governed the region on behalf of the Seljuk Sultan. Mahdi was a Shia Muslim, but he was loyal to his Seljuk overlords and had no sympathy for the Ismaili cause. Hassan's plan for capturing Alamut was elegant in its simplicity. He would not storm the walls or lay siege to the fortress. Instead, he would take it from within. His years of patient missionary work had created a network of Ismaili converts among the garrison and the local population. When the moment came, these converts would simply open the gates and welcome Hassan as their new master. The execution of the plan unfolded over several months. In 1090, Hassan himself entered the fortress in disguise, some sources say posing as a teacher or religious scholar. He was welcomed by his secret supporters among the garrison and given shelter within the walls. Meanwhile, more Ismaili converts infiltrated the castle, gradually shifting the balance of power. The commander, Mahdi, seems to have been unaware of what was happening under his nose. He may have noticed that some of his men were acting strangely, that there were new faces in the garrison, that conversations stopped when he approached, but he did not grasp the full extent of the conspiracy until it was too late. The final takeover happened quickly and almost bloodlessly. One day, Hassan simply revealed himself as the leader of the Ismaili community and announced that he was taking control of the fortress. The majority of the garrison, who had already converted to Ismailism, supported him. Those who remained loyal to Mahdi found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Mahdi himself was expelled from the fortress, reportedly given a sum of money as compensation for his loss and allowed to leave unharmed. The date of this takeover is recorded as September 4th, 1090. It was a pivotal moment in history, though few people at the time recognized its significance. A relatively obscure religious missionary had captured a remote mountain fortress. The Seljuk authorities, when they heard the news, probably regarded it as a minor annoyance, a local disturbance that could be dealt with in due course. They had no idea that they were witnessing the birth of a movement that would haunt them for generations. Hassan immediately set about consolidating his control and transforming Alamut into the headquarters of a new kind of state. He strengthened the fortifications, adding new walls and towers to make the already formidable position even more secure. He established storehouses for food and weapons, preparing for the sieges that he knew would come. He created systems for water collection and storage, ensuring that the garrison could survive even if cut off from the outside world. But Hassan's work went far beyond mere military preparations. He was building not just a fortress but a community, a society organized around the principles of Ismaili faith. Everyone at Alamut, from the highest commander to the lowest servant, was expected to follow the religious discipline that Hassan prescribed. There were regular prayers and religious instruction. There was strict hierarchy and absolute obedience to Hassan's authority. There was a sense of shared purpose and collective destiny that bound the community together. Hassan himself set the example. He lived simply, even ascetically, despite being the master of a growing domain. He spent his days in study, prayer, and administration. He rarely left the fortress, preferring to direct his movement from this secure base. He was accessible to his followers, willing to teach and guide them, but he also maintained an aura of mystery and authority that set him apart. The capture of Alamut was just the beginning. Hassan's vision extended far beyond a single fortress. He wanted to create a network of strongholds throughout the mountains of Persia, a state within a state that could survive and thrive despite the hostility of the surrounding powers. In the months and years following the capture of Alamut, his followers seized other fortresses in the region, using similar methods of infiltration and internal subversion. Some of these takeovers were peaceful, like Alamut itself. Local commanders were converted to Ismailism and simply handed over their fortresses to Hassan's representatives. Others involved more violence, as loyal Seljuk garrisons resisted and had to be overcome by force. But the pattern was consistent. The Ismailis were carving out a territory for themselves in the mountains, creating a refuge where they could practice their faith and organize their movement without fear of persecution. The Seljuk authorities, once they understood what was happening, were alarmed. This was not a simple rebellion that could be crushed with a show of force. It was a systematic challenge to their control over a strategically important region. The mountains of northern Persia commanded the routes between the Persian plateau and the Caspian Sea. They overlooked the wealthy cities of the lowlands. A hostile power entrenched in those mountains could cause endless trouble. The first Seljuk response came in 1092, when a military expedition was sent to recapture Alamut. The army that marched into the mountains was confident of success. They had overwhelming numbers and the resources of a great empire behind them. The Ismailis were a ragtag band of religious fanatics occupying a few remote castles. How hard could it be to dislodge them? The answer, as the Seljuks discovered, was very hard indeed. The terrain favoured the defenders at every turn. The narrow valleys and steep mountainsides made it impossible to deploy large forces effectively. Supply lines were vulnerable to ambush. The fortresses themselves were virtually impregnable, perched on rocky outcrops that defied assault. The siege of Alamut dragged on through the summer and into the fall. The Seljuk forces could not take the fortress by storm, and they could not starve it out quickly enough. Meanwhile, Hassan's supporters in the surrounding countryside harassed the besiegers, cutting off supplies and picking off stragglers. The army that had marched so confidently into the mountains began to melt away, weakened by disease, desertion, and constant attrition. And then came the event that changed everything. In October 1092, the great vizier Nizam al-Mulk was assassinated. He was travelling with the Sultan's court when a man disguised as a Sufi mystic approached him and stabbed him to death. The assassin was an Ismaili, one of Hassan's followers, and he made no attempt to escape. He was killed on the spot, apparently welcoming martyrdom. The death of Nizam al-Mulk sent shockwaves through the Seljuk Empire. He had been the real power behind the throne, the administrator who held the sprawling empire together. Without him, the government was thrown into confusion, and just weeks later, Sultan Malik Shah himself died under mysterious circumstances. Some sources suggest he was poisoned, possibly by agents of Hassan, though this has never been proven. The double blow of losing both the vizier and the sultan plunged the Seljuk Empire into a succession crisis. Different factions backed different claimants to the throne. Civil war broke out. The army besieging Alamut was recalled to deal with more pressing matters closer to home. Hassan and his followers had survived their first great test. The assassination of Nizam al-Mulk was a turning point in more ways than one. It demonstrated the effectiveness of Hassan's new strategy. A single killing, carefully planned and executed, had achieved more than any conventional military campaign could have. The Seljuk war machine, which had seemed so overwhelming, had been thrown into disarray by the death of one man. This lesson was not lost on Hassan. He would refine and systematize the use of assassination as a political tool, creating an organization dedicated to the targeted killing of enemies. The men who carried out these missions would become known as fidais, a word meaning those who sacrificed themselves. In the West, they would come to be called by another name, a name derived from a rumour about their use of hashish. They would be called assassins. With Alamut secure and the immediate Seljuk threat temporarily removed, Hassan turned his attention to building a lasting state. This was not simply a matter of military defence, though that remained important. Hassan wanted to create a complete society, a community of believers living according to Ismaili principles, a model of what the world could be if guided by divine wisdom. The territory that Hassan controlled was not large by the standards of conventional empires. It consisted of scattered fortresses and the valleys and villages that surrounded them, mostly in the Alborz mountains of northern Persia. But what it lacked in size, it made up for in cohesion and determination, and Every person in this territory was committed to the cause. There were no reluctant subjects, no conquered peoples waiting for a chance to rebel. This was a community united by faith. Hassan organized his state along hierarchical lines, reflecting the Ismaili belief in spiritual ranks and degrees of knowledge. At the top stood Hassan himself, bearing the title of Chief Dai, or sometimes simply the Sheikh of Alamut. He was the supreme authority in all matters, religious and political. His word was law, and his decisions were not to be questioned. Below Hassan were various ranks of officials and teachers. The senior dais were responsible for spreading the faith and overseeing the Ismaili communities in different regions. They were highly educated men, trained in theology, philosophy, and the arts of persuasion. They travelled throughout the Islamic world, maintaining contact with Ismaili believers and recruiting new converts. Below the dais were the rafiqs or companions, who served as soldiers, administrators, and skilled workers. They formed the backbone of the Ismaili state, doing the practical work of defence, construction, and daily governance. They were devoted believers, but they had not attained the higher levels of spiritual knowledge reserved for the dais. And then there were the fidais, the self-sacrificers, who occupied a special place in Hassan's organisation. These were young men who'd been selected for their courage, their devotion, and their willingness to give their lives for the cause. They were trained in the arts of combat and infiltration. They learned languages, studied the habits of potential targets, practiced the skills they would need to get close to heavily guarded enemies. When the time came, they would be sent out on missions from which they were not expected to return. The fidais were not mindless fanatics, despite how they were often portrayed by hostile sources. They were motivated by sincere religious belief, by the conviction that they were serving God and the Imam, by eliminating the enemies of the faith. They believed that death in such a cause would bring them immediate entry to paradise. This made them fearless in a way that conventional soldiers could never be. They did not fight to survive. They fought to succeed regardless of the personal cost. The selection and training of fidais was a careful process. Candidates were observed from a young age, their character and abilities assessed. Those who showed the right qualities were gradually introduced to more advanced teachings and given increasingly demanding tasks. By the time they were ready for actual missions, they had been thoroughly indoctrinated and tested. They were absolutely reliable, utterly committed to carrying out whatever orders they received. Hassan also devoted considerable attention to the physical infrastructure of his state. The fortresses were constantly improved, their defences strengthened, their storage facilities expanded. New castles were built or captured, extending the network of Ismaili strongholds. Roads and paths were improved to allow communication between the scattered outposts. Systems were established for collecting taxes and distributing resources. Alamut itself became something of a showpiece. Hassan built a famous library there, collecting books on every subject: philosophy, science, religion, history. He attracted scholars and intellectuals who were drawn by the opportunity to study and debate in an atmosphere of intellectual freedom. The Library of Alamut became renowned throughout the Islamic world, a centre of learning that rivaled the great institutions of Baghdad and Cairo. This emphasis on learning was not merely for show. Hassan believed that knowledge was power, that understanding the world was essential to changing it. He encouraged his followers to study, to question, to seek truth wherever it might be found. This intellectual orientation gave the Ismaili movement a sophistication that set it apart from mere banditry or rebellion. The religious life of the community was carefully structured. There were regular prayers and religious observances. There were lectures and discussions on theological topics. There were rituals that reinforced the sense of belonging to a special community with a unique mission. Hassan himself often led these religious activities, teaching and preaching to his followers. The doctrine that Hassan taught was a distinctive version of Ismailism, adapted to the circumstances of his movement. He emphasized the absolute necessity of the Imam as the source of religious guidance. Without the Imam, he taught, human beings could not truly understand God's will or achieve salvation. This made loyalty to the Imam the supreme religious duty, more important than any other obligation. But here was the complication. The Ismaili world was now divided over the question of who the true Imam was. When Caliph al-Mustansir died in 1094, the succession dispute that Hassan had foreseen finally erupted. The powerful vizier in Cairo installed al-Mustali as the new caliph, passing over the elder son, Nizar. Nizar attempted to resist but was defeated and killed. For Hassan, this was a crisis and an opportunity. He had always supported Nizar's claim to the succession. Now he declared that the Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo had fallen into error by following the wrong Imam. The true line of Imams continued through Nizar and his descendants. Hassan and his followers were the faithful remnant, the ones who had remained loyal to the legitimate Imam. This declaration marked the formal split between the Nizari Ismailis, who followed Hassan, and the Mustali Ismailis, who remained loyal to the Fatimid Caliphate. It was a momentous division that would shape Ismaili history for centuries. The Nizaris, under Hassan's leadership, became an independent movement, no longer subordinate to Cairo. The question of where the Nizari Imam actually was became somewhat complicated. Nizar had been killed, and his descendants, if any survived, were in hiding. Hassan never claimed to be the Imam himself. Instead, he claimed to be acting on behalf of the hidden Imam, serving as his representative until the Imam could reveal himself. This gave Hassan enormous authority, while maintaining the theological principle that the Imam was the ultimate source of guidance. In practice, Hassan exercised something close to absolute power within his domain. His followers obeyed him as if he were the Imam, following his commands without question. He made all important decisions, from matters of religious doctrine to questions of military strategy. He was judge, lawgiver, and commander all in one. This concentration of power might seem like a recipe for tyranny, and in some ways it was. Hassan could be harsh and unforgiving. He demanded absolute loyalty and punished disloyalty severely. There are stories of him executing his own sons, one for allegedly drinking wine and another for allegedly committing murder. Whether these stories are literally true or have been embellished over time, they convey something important about Hassan's character. He held himself and his family to the same strict standards he imposed on everyone else. No one was above the law of the community. But Hassan was not simply a tyrant. He was also a builder, a thinker, a man who genuinely believed he was serving a higher purpose. He created institutions that would outlast him. He trained successors who would continue his work. He established a state that would survive for over a century and a half after his death. Whatever his faults, he was one of the most effective leaders of the medieval period. The daily life of ordinary people in Hassan's domain was probably not so different from life in the surrounding regions. Farmers tended their fields in the mountain valleys. Craftsmen practiced their trades. Merchants bought and sold goods. Children were born, grew up, married, and had children of their own. The great dramas of politics and war were distant concerns for most people, who were more worried about the harvest or the weather. But there were differences too. The sense of belonging to a special community, of being part of something important, must have been powerful. The religious instruction and communal rituals created bonds between people. The knowledge that they were surrounded by enemies, that their survival depended on their unity and determination, fostered a siege mentality that strengthened group cohesion. Women in Hassan's community seem to have had somewhat more freedom than in some other parts of the Islamic world, though our sources on this point are limited. There are references to women participating in the defence of fortresses, to educated women who engaged in religious discussions, to a general atmosphere that valued ability over gender. But we should be cautious about drawing too many conclusions from fragmentary evidence. The economy of the Nizari state was based on a combination of agriculture, trade, and what might politely be called protection payments. The mountain valleys produced grain, fruits, and livestock. Trade routes passed through or near Ismaili territory, and merchants found it wise to pay for safe passage. And sometimes, when other sources of revenue were insufficient, the Ismailis demanded tribute from neighbouring rulers, backed by the implicit threat of assassination. This last point brings us back to the most controversial aspect of Hassan's legacy. The systematic use of assassination as a political tool was not just a military tactic, it was also an economic strategy. Rulers who refused to pay tribute or who actively opposed the Ismailis might find themselves targeted for elimination. The threat alone was often enough to secure cooperation. Why risk death when a modest payment would ensure safety? This protection racket, if we can call it that, made the Nizari state financially viable, despite its limited territory. It also spread fear far beyond the boundaries of Ismaili control. Rulers throughout the Middle East had to consider the possibility that an Ismaili agent might be lurking among their servants or guards. This constant anxiety was itself a form of power, allowing Hassan to punch far above his weight in the political arena. The word assassin has become so common in modern languages that we rarely think about its origins. We use it to describe anyone who kills a prominent person for political reasons. But the word has a specific historical origin, and that origin lies with Hassan-i Sabbah and his followers. The term comes from the Arabic word hashishin, which was applied to the Nizari Ismailis by their enemies. The exact meaning and origin of this term have been debated for centuries. The most famous explanation is that the Ismaili fidais used hashish, a drug derived from cannabis, as part of their training or motivation. According to this theory, the young men were given hashish to induce visions of paradise, convincing them that the rewards awaiting them after death were real and wonderful. This explanation was popularized by Marco Polo, the famous Venetian traveller who passed through the region in the late 13th century, long after Hassan's death. Marco Polo told a vivid story about the old man of the mountain who maintained a beautiful secret garden filled with every pleasure. Young men would be drugged and brought to this garden, where they would enjoy its delights. Then they would be drugged again and removed. When they awoke, they would be told that they had been given a glimpse of paradise, and that they could return there permanently if they died in service to the old man. It is a wonderful story, and it captured the imagination of Europeans for centuries. But most modern historians are sceptical. There is no evidence from Ismaili sources that hashish played any role in the training of fidais. The term hashishin may have been simply a term of abuse, implying that the Ismailis were lowlifes or outcasts. It may have referred to their ascetic lifestyle, living on herbs and simple food. Or it may have had some other meaning entirely that has been lost to time. What we do know is that the fidais were not drugged fanatics but carefully selected and trained operatives. Their motivation came not from artificial visions but from sincere religious belief. They genuinely believed that they were serving God and the Imam, that their actions were righteous, and that paradise awaited them. This made them far more dangerous than any drug-induced zealot could be. They were intelligent, adaptable, and utterly committed. The training of a fidai was comprehensive. They learned combat skills, of course, how to use daggers and swords, how to fight in close quarters. But they also learned languages, so they could operate in different regions without arousing suspicion. They studied the customs and etiquette of different courts, so they could blend in among servants and retainers. They practiced patience, learning to wait for months or even years for the right opportunity to strike. The preferred weapon of the Fidais was the dagger. This was a practical choice. A dagger could be concealed easily, carried into places where swords would be forbidden. It required getting close to the target, which meant that the Fidai had to be skilled at infiltration and deception. But it also sent a message. A dagger killing was personal, intimate. It showed that the Ismailis could reach anyone, no matter how well protected. The Fidais almost never tried to escape after completing their missions. This was partly practical, since escape was usually impossible, but it was also ideological. By accepting death, the Fidai demonstrated the depth of his commitment. He showed that the Ismailis were not afraid to die, that they could not be deterred by threats of punishment. This willingness to embrace martyrdom was one of the most powerful weapons in Hassan's arsenal. The targets of assassination were carefully chosen. They were not random killings designed to spread terror among the general population. Instead, they were surgical strikes against specific individuals who posed a threat to the Ismaili cause. Military commanders who led campaigns against Ismaili fortresses, religious scholars who preached against Ismaili beliefs, political leaders who persecuted Ismaili communities. These were the people who found themselves on Hassan's list. The assassination of Nizam al-Mulk in 1092 was the first major success of this strategy, and it established the pattern for what would follow. Over the next several decades, dozens of prominent figures were killed by Ismaili Fidais. Governors, generals, judges, and scholars all fell to the dagger. The message was clear. Opposition to the Ismailis could be fatal, regardless of how powerful or well protected you might be. The psychological impact of these assassinations was enormous. Rulers throughout the Middle East became paranoid, suspicious of everyone around them. They increased their personal guards, screened their servants more carefully, avoided public appearances. Some took to wearing chainmail beneath their robes, hoping to survive a dagger thrust. Others surrounded themselves with loyal bodyguards who never left their side, even when they slept. But no amount of precaution could guarantee safety. The Fidais were patient and resourceful. They would spend months or even years infiltrating a target's household, gaining trust, waiting for the perfect moment. A servant who had worked faithfully for years might suddenly reveal himself as an Ismaili agent. A guard who had sworn loyalty might turn his weapon against his master. No one could be entirely trusted. This atmosphere of fear and suspicion was itself a weapon. It distracted rulers from other concerns, consumed their energy and attention, made them less effective leaders. It also created opportunities for the Ismailis to negotiate from a position of strength. A ruler who feared assassination might be willing to make concessions, to leave the Ismailis alone, to pay tribute in exchange for safety. The list of victims attributed to the Ismaili Fidais is long and impressive. In addition to Nizam al-Mulk, they killed numerous other Seljuk officials and military commanders. They assassinated the Caliph al-Mustashid in 1135 and his successor al-Rashid in 1138. They killed the Count of Tripoli, Raymond II, in 1152, demonstrating that even Crusader lords were not beyond their reach. They made attempts on the lives of Saladin, the great Muslim hero who recaptured Jerusalem from the Crusaders, though these attempts failed. Each assassination sent ripples through the political world. Successions were disrupted, alliances shifted, policies changed. The Ismailis could not conquer territory through conventional warfare, but they could shape events through carefully targeted violence. They were pioneers of what we might today call asymmetric warfare, using unconventional methods to offset their disadvantage in numbers and resources. The fame of the assassins spread far beyond the Islamic world. Crusaders who encountered them in the Holy Land brought stories back to Europe. These stories grew in the telling, becoming more fantastic and terrifying with each retelling. The old man of the mountain became a figure of legend, a mysterious and sinister power who commanded absolute obedience from his followers. Some of these European accounts were wildly inaccurate, mixing fact with fantasy in ways that obscured the reality of the Ismaili movement. But they captured something true about the fear that the assassins inspired. Here was a power that operated by different rules, that could not be defeated by conventional means, that struck without warning and disappeared without trace. It was a new kind of threat, and the medieval world struggled to understand it. The Ismailis themselves had a different perspective on their activities. They did not see themselves as terrorists or murderers. They saw themselves as soldiers in a cosmic struggle between truth and falsehood, between the rightful imam and the usurpers who had stolen his authority. The people they killed were not innocent victims, but enemies of God who deserved their fate. The fidayis who carried out these missions were not criminals but martyrs, heroes who sacrificed their lives for the highest cause. This self-understanding is important for grasping the Ismaili phenomenon. The fidayis were not mercenaries killing for money or psychopaths killing for pleasure. They were true believers, motivated by sincere religious conviction. This made them both more dangerous and more sympathetic than simple, hired killers. They believed they were doing right, and that belief gave them strength. Hassan-i Sabbah presided over this system from his fortress at Alamut. He planned the assassinations, selected the targets, trained the fidayis. But he did not carry out the killings himself. He remained in his mountain stronghold, directing operations from a distance, a spider at the centre of a web that stretched across the Middle East. The organization that Hassan created was remarkably sophisticated for its time. It had clear hierarchies and chains of command. It had systems for gathering intelligence, for communicating across long distances, for coordinating actions in different regions. It had methods for recruiting, training, and motivating operatives. In many ways, it resembled a modern intelligence agency more than a medieval religious sect. This organizational sophistication was one of Hassan's greatest achievements. He took the loose networks of Ismaili believers that existed throughout the Islamic world and transformed them into a disciplined, effective force. He created structures that could survive the loss of individual members, that could adapt to changing circumstances, that could pursue long-term goals with patience and persistence. The success of the assassins inspired both imitation and countermeasures. Other groups tried to adopt similar tactics, with varying degrees of success. Rulers developed new methods of protection and surveillance. The cat-and-mouse game between assassins and their targets became a permanent feature of medieval politics. But no one matched the Ismailis in the systematic, sustained use of assassination as a political tool. For over a century and a half, from the capture of Alamut in 1090 to the Mongol conquest in 1256, the assassins remained a force to be reckoned with. They outlasted the Seljuk Empire that had tried to destroy them. They survived the Crusades and the rise and fall of various dynasties. They became a permanent part of the political landscape, feared and respected in equal measure. The Seljuk Empire never accepted the existence of an independent Ismaili state in the heart of its territory. From the moment Hassan captured Alamut, the Seljuks were determined to dislodge him. What followed was a prolonged struggle that lasted for decades, a war of sieges and raids, assassinations and reprisals that tested both sides to their limits. The first major Seljuk campaign against Alamut, as we have seen, ended in failure. The death of Nizam al-Mulk and Sultan Malik Shah threw the empire into confusion, and the besieging army was withdrawn. But this was only a temporary reprieve. Once the succession disputes were settled and a new sultan firmly established, the pressure on the Ismailis resumed. The geography of the conflict favoured the defenders. The Alborz Mountains were a natural fortress, with narrow valleys, steep cliffs, and limited access routes. An army marching into this terrain was immediately at a disadvantage. Supply lines were vulnerable, movement was restricted, and the defenders knew every path and hiding place. The Seljuks had overwhelming numbers, but numbers meant little in country where a handful of men could hold a pass against thousands. The Ismaili fortresses were designed to exploit these advantages. They were built on rocky outcrops and mountain peaks, accessible only by narrow paths that could be easily defended. Their walls were thick and strong, able to withstand the siege weapons of the time. They had cisterns for collecting rainwater and storerooms for food, allowing them to hold out for months or even years. Alamut was the strongest of these fortresses, but it was not the only one. Over the years following the initial capture, the Ismailis seized or built dozens of other strongholds throughout the region. Some were in the Alborz mountains near Alamut. Others were in the Zagros mountains to the west, or in the remote regions of Kohistan in eastern Persia. Together, they formed a network of mutually supporting positions that was extremely difficult to reduce. So the Seljuk strategy was to isolate and besiege these fortresses one by one, cutting them off from supplies and reinforcements until they were forced to surrender. This approach had worked against conventional enemies, but it was less effective against the Ismailis. The mountain terrain made it hard to maintain a tight siege. The Ismaili garrisons were highly motivated and well supplied, and the threat of assassination hung over every Seljuk commander, making them cautious and hesitant. Several major campaigns were launched against the Ismailis during Hassan's lifetime. In 1100, a large Seljuk army besieged the fortress of Girdku in Kohistan. The siege lasted for years, but the fortress never fell. The defenders held out with remarkable determination, surviving on minimal rations and repelling every assault. Eventually, the Seljuks gave up and withdrew. Similar patterns repeated at other fortresses. The Seljuks would arrive with a large force, establish a siege, and settle in for a long wait. The Ismailis would defend stubbornly, launching sorties to disrupt the besiegers, receiving supplies through secret routes, holding on until the enemy lost patience, or was called away to deal with other problems. It was a war of attrition that the Ismailis, with their smaller forces but greater determination, were well equipped to fight. The Ismailis also took the offensive when opportunities arose. They raided Seljuk territory, attacking caravans and isolated outposts. They assassinated Seljuk officials and commanders, disrupting the enemy's leadership. They supported rebellions and dissidents within the Seljuk Empire, exploiting every crack in the enemy's unity. One particularly effective tactic was the assassination of military commanders during active campaigns. A general who was killed in the middle of a siege left his army leaderless and demoralized. His successor might have different priorities or less commitment to the campaign. The army might simply fall apart, its soldiers drifting away to seek easier employment elsewhere. A single dagger thrust could accomplish what months of conventional resistance could not. The Seljuks tried various countermeasures. They offered rewards for information about Ismaili agents. They conducted purges of suspected sympathizers. They built their own network of spies and informants, but they could never entirely eliminate the threat. The Ismailis were too well organized, too deeply embedded in the population, too skilled at concealment. The war also had an ideological dimension. The Seljuks portrayed themselves as defenders of Sunni orthodoxy against Ismaili heresy. They sponsored religious scholars who wrote polemics against Ismaili beliefs. They encouraged persecution of Ismaili communities in areas under their control. This religious framing helped mobilize support for the war and justified the harsh measures taken against suspected Ismailis. The Ismailis responded with their own propaganda. They portrayed the Seljuks as usurpers and tyrants, oppressors of the true believers. They emphasized the corruption and injustice of Seljuk rule, contrasting it with the righteous community they were building in the mountains. They presented their struggle as a cosmic battle between good and evil, with the Imam's cause destined to ultimately triumph. This ideological warfare was fought through sermons, pamphlets, and personal conversations. Ismaili dayas continued their missionary work even in the midst of military conflict, seeking to convert Seljuk subjects and undermine the enemy from within. Every convert was a small victory, a sign that the truth was spreading despite persecution. The prolonged conflict took a toll on both sides. The Seljuks expended enormous resources on campaigns that achieved little lasting result. The constant threat of assassination created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that poisoned political life. The empire was weakened, distracted from other challenges, unable to fully consolidate its power. The Ismailis, for their part, lived under constant siege. Their territory was limited, their resources stretched thin. They could not engage in normal trade or agriculture, dependent instead on what they could produce within their mountain valleys and what they could extract from neighbours through tribute or raiding. Life in the Ismaili state was hard, demanding constant vigilance and sacrifice. But the Ismailis had one crucial advantage. They were fighting for something they believed in, a cause that gave meaning to their struggles and sacrifices. The Seljuk soldiers either were fighting for pay and plunder, or because their lords commanded them. The Ismaili fighters were fighting for God and the Imam, for the salvation of their souls and the triumph of truth. This difference in motivation mattered enormously in a war of attrition where willpower was as important as military strength. As the years passed, a kind of stalemate emerged. The Seljuks could not destroy the Ismaili state, but the Ismailis could not expand beyond their mountain strongholds. The two sides settled into a pattern of intermittent warfare, punctuated by periods of uneasy peace. Neither could achieve a decisive victory, so both learned to live with the conflict. This stalemate would persist long after Hassan's death. The Ismaili state he founded would survive for over a century and a half, outlasting the Seljuk Empire itself. It would take a new and more terrible enemy, the Mongols, to finally bring down the eagle's nest. But that story belongs to a later chapter. Hassan-i Sabbah was not merely a military leader and political strategist. He was also a scholar and thinker, a man who valued knowledge and learning as highly as he valued fortresses and fighters. Under his leadership, Alamut became not just a military stronghold, but a centre of intellectual activity, a place where ideas were debated and books were treasured. The library of Alamut became famous throughout the Islamic world. Hassan collected books on every subject: philosophy, theology, science, mathematics, history, literature. He sent agents to acquire rare manuscripts from distant cities. He welcomed scholars who wished to study and debate in an atmosphere of intellectual freedom. The library grew to contain thousands of volumes, a treasure trove of human knowledge assembled in an unlikely mountain fortress. This emphasis on learning was not merely a personal hobby of Hassan's. It was integral to his vision of what the Ismaili community should be. The Ismailis believed that true understanding of religion required deep knowledge, that the hidden meanings of scripture could only be grasped through careful study and reflection. A community of ignorant believers was not what Hassan wanted. He wanted a community of educated, thoughtful people who understood why they believed what they believed. The educational system at Alamut reflected this priority. Young people received instruction not just in religious matters, but in a broad range of subjects. They learned to read and write, of course, but they also studied logic, philosophy, mathematics, and natural science. The goal was to produce well-rounded individuals who could think critically and argue persuasively. This educational emphasis had practical benefits as well. The Dais who spread the Ismaili faith needed to be able to engage with educated people, to answer their questions and address their objections. A Dai who could only recite memorized formulas would not be very effective. A Dai who could discuss philosophy and science, who could meet scholars on their own ground, was far more likely to win converts. Hassan himself was deeply engaged in intellectual work. He wrote several books, though most have been lost to time. We know of a work on Ismaili doctrine, explaining the principles of the faith and defending them against critics. We know of autobiographical writings, in which he described his own spiritual journey and conversion. We know of letters and treatises on various subjects. These writings were studied and copied by his followers, becoming part of the intellectual heritage of the Nizari Ismaili movement. The theological system that Hassan developed was sophisticated and carefully reasoned. At its centre was the doctrine of talim, authoritative teaching. Hassan argued that human reason alone was insufficient to discover religious truth. People needed guidance from a divinely appointed teacher, the Imam, who possessed knowledge that ordinary humans could not attain on their own. Without the Imam, people would wander in confusion, unable to distinguish truth from falsehood. This doctrine had important implications. It meant that loyalty to the Imam was not just a political obligation, but a religious necessity. It meant that the teachings of the Imam, transmitted through his authorized representatives, had to be accepted without question. It meant that independent reasoning in religious matters was dangerous and potentially heretical. Critics accused Hassan of demanding blind obedience, of suppressing independent thought. There is some justice to this criticism. The Ismaili system did place enormous authority in the hands of the Imam and his representatives. It did discourage questioning and dissent, but Hassan would have responded that this was not blind obedience, but enlightened submission. The Imam possessed genuine knowledge that ordinary people lacked. Following his guidance was not foolishness but wisdom. The daily life of the community at Alamut was structured around religious observance. There were regular prayers, performed at the appointed times each day. There were religious lectures and discussions, where the teachings of the faith were explained and explored. There were rituals and ceremonies that marked important occasions and reinforced the bonds of community. But life was not all prayer and study. The practical necessities of survival in a mountain fortress demanded constant attention. There were walls to maintain and strengthen. There were weapons to forge and repair. There were supplies to gather and store. There were fields to cultivate in the valleys below, livestock to tend, water to collect and conserve. Everyone in the community had a role to play. The division of labour was clear and hierarchical, reflecting the Ismaili belief in spiritual ranks. But there was also a sense of shared purpose that cut across these divisions. Everyone, from the highest Dai to the lowest servant, was part of the same struggle, working toward the same goals. This sense of common cause was one of the great strengths of the Ismaili community. The position of women in this community is difficult to assess from the available sources. Most medieval accounts focus on the male leaders and fighters, saying little about women's lives. But there are hints that women played more active roles than in some other medieval societies. There are references to women participating in the defence of fortresses, to educated women who engaged in religious discussions, to a general atmosphere that valued ability regardless of gender. We should be cautious about reading too much into these fragmentary references. The Ismaili community was still a product of its time and place, shaped by the patriarchal norms of medieval Islamic society. Women's roles were probably still limited compared to men's, but there may have been somewhat more flexibility and opportunity than in the surrounding cultures. The economy of the Ismaili state was necessarily modest. The mountain territory could not support large-scale agriculture or industry. The community relied on what could be grown in the valleys, supplemented by trade, tribute, and occasional raiding. Resources were carefully managed, with an emphasis on self-sufficiency and resilience. This economic constraint shaped many aspects of life. There was little room for luxury or ostentation. Even the leaders lived relatively simply, at least by the standards of medieval rulers. Hassan himself was famous for his austere lifestyle, spending his days in study and prayer rather than in feasting and entertainment. This austerity was both a practical necessity and a moral statement, a demonstration that the Ismaili community was different from the corrupt and worldly powers that surrounded it. The isolation of the mountain fortresses created a distinctive social atmosphere. Everyone knew everyone else. Privacy was limited. The community was bound together by shared beliefs, shared dangers, and shared sacrifices. This closeness could be comforting, providing a sense of belonging and support, but it could also be stifling, with little escape from the watchful eyes of neighbours and superiors. The constant threat of attack from outside reinforced this sense of solidarity. The Ismailis knew that they were surrounded by enemies, that their survival depended on their unity and determination. This siege mentality fostered a strong in-group identity, a sharp distinction between the faithful community and the hostile world outside. It also justified the strict discipline and hierarchy that characterized Ismaili society. Hassan ruled this community for over 30 years, from the capture of Alamut in 1090 until his death in 1124. During this time he rarely left the fortress. He devoted himself to study, prayer, and the administration of his growing movement. He received reports from dais across the Islamic world, made decisions about strategy and policy, and guided the development of Ismaili doctrine. His personal life during these years was marked by tragedy. According to some sources, Hassan had 2 sons executed. One was accused of drinking wine, a serious violation of Islamic law. The other was accused of involvement in an unauthorized killing. Whether these stories are literally true or have been embellished over time, they convey something important about Hassan's character. He held himself and his family to the same strict standards he imposed on everyone else. No one was above the law of the community, not even the sons of the leader. This severity earned Hassan both respect and fear. He was not a warm or approachable figure. He was a man of iron will and uncompromising principle, dedicated to his cause above all personal considerations. His followers revered him as a saint and a genius. His enemies regarded him as a fanatic and a monster. Both views captured something true about this complex and formidable man. As Hassan-i Sabbah entered the final decade of his life, he could look back on remarkable achievements. He had built a state from nothing, carved out a territory in the heart of a hostile empire, created an organization that struck fear into the mightiest rulers of the age. The Nizari Ismaili movement that he led had survived every attempt to destroy it and had established itself as a permanent feature of the political landscape. But Hassan was also aware of the challenges that lay ahead. He was growing old, and the question of succession weighed heavily on his mind. The movement he had built depended heavily on his personal authority and abilities. Could it survive without him? Could anyone else provide the leadership that had brought it this far? The tragedy of his son's executions meant that Hassan had no direct heir to succeed him. This was perhaps deliberate. Hassan may have believed that hereditary succession was inappropriate for the leadership of a religious movement, that the position should go to the most capable person rather than simply passing from father to son. Or he may have simply been unwilling to compromise his principles even for the sake of his own family. Whatever his reasoning, Hassan chose his successors carefully. He designated a man named Kia Buzurg Umid to follow him as the leader of Alamut. Buzurg Umid was a trusted lieutenant who had proven his abilities over many years of service. He was not a charismatic visionary like Hassan, but he was a capable administrator and a devoted believer. He would maintain the system that Hassan had created, even if he could not match its founder's genius. The final years of Hassan's life were spent in the same routine that had characterized his decades at Alamut. He studied, he prayed, he administered the affairs of his community. He continued to direct the activities of dais across the Islamic world, to plan assassinations and military operations, to guide the development of Ismaili doctrine. Age slowed him but did not stop him. Hassan died on June 12, 1124, at approximately 74 years of age. He had spent the last 34 years of his life at Alamut, never leaving the fortress that had become the symbol of his movement. He died in his bed, surrounded by his followers, having accomplished more than most people could dream of. The death of Hassan-i Sabbah was a momentous event for the Nizari Ismaili community. He had been their leader for so long that many could not remember a time before him. He had shaped every aspect of their movement, from its theology to its military tactics to its organizational structure. His passing left a void that would be difficult to fill, but Hassan had prepared for this moment. The succession proceeded smoothly, with Buzurgumid taking over as the new leader of Alamut. The systems and structures that Hassan had created continued to function. The fortresses remained secure, the dais continued their work, the fidais remained ready to strike. The movement that Hassan had built was strong enough to survive the loss of its founder. The immediate aftermath of Hassan's death saw no dramatic changes. The Seljuks did not launch a major offensive, perhaps hoping that the movement would collapse on its own without its charismatic leader. The Ismailis continued their established policies, defending their territory, conducting assassinations, spreading their faith. Life went on much as it had before, but something had changed nonetheless. Hassan had been more than just a leader. He had been a symbol, a living embodiment of the Ismaili cause. His personal authority had held the movement together, resolved disputes, and inspired devotion. His successors would have to find other ways to maintain unity and motivation. The legacy that Hassan left behind was complex and multifaceted. He had created a state that would survive for over a century after his death. He had developed a system of targeted assassination that would influence political violence for centuries to come. He had built a library and a tradition of learning that would preserve and transmit knowledge. He had articulated a theological vision that would shape Ismaili thought for generations. But Hassan's legacy was also controversial. The assassinations that he ordered caused immense suffering and disrupted political life across the Middle East. The strict discipline of his community could shade into tyranny and oppression. The absolute claims he made for the Imam's authority left little room for dissent or independent thought. Hassan was a great man, but he was not necessarily a good man, at least not by every measure. The judgment of history on Hassan-i Sabbah has varied, depending on who is doing the judging. For the Nizari Ismailis, he remains a revered figure, the founder of their community and a saint of their faith. For many Muslims, he was a dangerous heretic who spread division and violence. For Western observers, he has often been a figure of fascination and horror, the mysterious old man of the mountain who commanded an army of fanatical killers. Perhaps the fairest assessment is that Hassan was a product of his time and circumstances. He lived in an age of religious conflict and political violence when the stakes of theological disputes were measured in blood. He faced enemies who would have destroyed him and his followers without mercy. He used the tools available to him, including assassination, to survive and advance his cause. Whether this makes him a hero or a villain depends on one's perspective and values. What is beyond dispute is that Hassan-i Sabbah was one of the most remarkable figures of the medieval period. From humble beginnings, he rose to challenge the mightiest powers of his age. He created something new in the world, a state and a movement that operated by different rules than anything that had come before. He left a mark on history that endures to this day, in the very word assassin that derives from his followers. The death of Hassan-i Sabbah in 1124 did not mark the end of the Nizari Ismaili state. The movement he had founded would continue for another 132 years, surviving challenges that would have destroyed lesser organizations. The story of what happened after Hassan is essential for understanding the full scope of his achievement and the ultimate fate of his creation. Buzurg Ummid, Hassan's chosen successor, ruled Alamut for 14 years, from 1124 to 1138. He was a competent leader who maintained the systems Hassan had established. Under his guidance, the Ismaili state continued to expand, capturing new fortresses and extending its influence. The assassinations continued as well, with several prominent figures falling to Ismaili daggers during this period. Buzurg Ummid was succeeded by his son, Muhammad, who ruled from 1138 to 1162. This was a significant development, as it established a pattern of hereditary succession that would continue for the rest of the Alamut period. The leadership of the Nizari Ismailis was becoming a dynasty, even though the leaders still claimed to be acting on behalf of the hidden imam rather than being imams themselves. The most dramatic development of this period came in 1164, under the leadership of Hassan II, the grandson of Buzurg Ummid. In that year, Hassan made a stunning announcement. He declared that the resurrection had arrived, that the hidden meanings of religious law were now revealed, and that the outward observances of Islam were no longer necessary. This declaration, known as the Qiyamah or resurrection, transformed Nizari Ismailism from a strict, law-observant community into something much more radical. The Qiyamah was a theological revolution. It proclaimed that the age of concealment was over, that believers could now live in direct communion with spiritual truth without the mediation of external religious forms. Fasting, prayer, and other ritual obligations were suspended. The community was invited to celebrate its liberation from the constraints of ordinary religion. This development would have astonished Hassan-i Sabbah, who had been a strict observer of religious law and had executed his own son for drinking wine. But it was in some ways a logical extension of Ismaili principles. If the hidden meaning of religion was more important than the outward form, then perhaps the outward form could eventually be discarded altogether. The Qiyamah took this logic to its ultimate conclusion. The Qiyamah period lasted for about 50 years, until it was gradually reversed by later leaders who restored the observance of Islamic law. But it left a lasting mark on Nizari Ismaili identity, reinforcing the sense that this was a community set apart from ordinary Muslims, following its own path to spiritual truth. Throughout this period, the Nizari Ismaili state continued to function as a political and military entity. The fortresses remained secure, the assassinations continued, the dais spread the faith. The movement even expanded into Syria, where a separate branch of Nizari Ismailis established their own network of fortresses in the mountains. The Syrian Ismailis would become famous in their own right, interacting with the Crusader states and becoming the assassins most familiar to European observers. The Syrian branch was led for many years by a remarkable figure known as Rashid al-Din Sinan, who ruled from around 1162 to 1193. Sinan was known to the Crusaders as the Old Man of the Mountain, a title that was sometimes applied to the leaders at Alamut as well. He was a skilled diplomat and strategist who navigated the complex politics of the Crusader period, sometimes allying with Christians against Muslims, sometimes the reverse, always pursuing the interests of his community. Sinan's most famous exploit was his alleged attempt to assassinate Saladin, the great Muslim leader who recaptured Jerusalem from the Crusaders in 1187. According to some accounts, Ismaili Fidais twice penetrated Saladin's camp and came close to killing him, only to be discovered at the last moment. Whether these stories are entirely accurate is uncertain, but they illustrate the reach and audacity of the Ismaili assassination network. The relationship between the Syrian Ismailis and the Crusaders was complex and often misunderstood. The Crusaders were both fascinated and terrified by the assassins, and many legends grew up around them. The story of the old man of the mountain and his garden of paradise, popularized by Marco Polo, probably originated in Crusader accounts of the Syrian Ismailis. These stories mixed fact and fantasy in ways that obscured the reality of the Ismaili movement. Back in Persia, the Nizari Ismaili state continued to hold its mountain fortresses against all comers. The Seljuk Empire, which had been the great enemy in Hassan's time, gradually declined and fragmented. New powers rose and fell. The Ismailis adapted to each change, making alliances when useful, conducting assassinations when necessary, always maintaining their independence. But a new threat was emerging in the east, one that would prove far more dangerous than any the Ismailis had faced before. The Mongols, united under Genghis Khan, had begun their great conquests in the early 13th century. They swept across Central Asia, destroying everything in their path. By the 1250s, they had turned their attention to the Islamic heartlands, and the Nizari Ismaili state lay directly in their path. The Mongol leader Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, was determined to destroy the Ismailis once and for all. Unlike previous enemies, the Mongols had the resources and the ruthlessness to accomplish this goal. They assembled a massive army and advanced on the Ismaili fortresses with overwhelming force. The Nizari Imam at this time was Rukn al-Din Khursha, a young and inexperienced leader who faced an impossible situation. The Mongols demanded surrender, promising safety if the Ismailis submitted and destruction if they resisted. Rukn al-Din, hoping to save his people, chose to surrender. He ordered the Ismaili fortresses to open their gates to the Mongols. Most of the fortresses complied, though a few held out in defiance. Alamut itself surrendered in 1256, ending 166 years of Ismaili rule. The Mongols systematically destroyed the fortifications, tearing down the walls that had defied so many enemies. They also destroyed the famous library of Alamut, burning books that had been collected over generations. This was one of the great cultural losses of the medieval period, as countless irreplaceable manuscripts were consumed by the flames. Rukn al-Din was taken to the Mongol court, where he was initially treated with some respect, but his usefulness soon ended. When a few Ismaili fortresses continued to resist, the Mongols blamed Rukn al-Din and had him executed. Most of his family and followers were also killed in the massacres that followed the conquest. The destruction of Alamut and the other Ismaili fortresses marked the end of the Nizari Ismaili state as a political entity. The movement that Hassan-i Sabbah had founded, that had survived for over a century and a half, that had defied the mightiest powers of the age, was finally crushed by the Mongol onslaught. But the Nizari Ismaili community itself survived. Many Ismailis escaped the Mongol massacres and went into hiding. They dispersed across the Islamic world, maintaining their faith in secret, passing their traditions from generation to generation. The line of imams continued, though now in concealment rather than ruling from mountain fortresses. Over the following centuries, the Nizari Ismailis gradually rebuilt their community. They established themselves in various regions, including Persia, Central Asia, and the Indian subcontinent. They adapted to changing circumstances, sometimes practicing their faith openly, sometimes concealing it to avoid persecution. They developed new forms of religious expression and community organization suited to their changed situation. In the 19th century, the Nizari Ismaili Imams emerged from centuries of relative obscurity. The Imam, at that time, Hassan-i Sabbah, received the title of Aga Khan from the Persian Shah. He later moved to India, where he became an important figure in the British colonial system. His descendants have continued to lead the Nizari Ismaili community to the present day. The current Aga Khan, the fourth to bear that title, is a direct descendant of the Imams who ruled at Alamut, and through them a spiritual heir to the movement that Hassan-i Sabbah founded. Under his leadership, the Nizari Ismailis have become a prosperous and well-organized global community, known for their emphasis on education, development, and interfaith dialogue. The Aga Khan Development Network operates in dozens of countries, providing healthcare, education, and economic opportunities to millions of people. This modern Ismaili community bears little resemblance to the fortress-dwelling warriors of Hassan's time. The assassinations have long since ceased. The mountain strongholds are ruins visited by tourists. The fierce sectarian conflicts of the medieval period have given way to a more peaceful coexistence. But the thread of continuity remains. The Nizari Ismailis of today trace their spiritual lineage directly back to Hassan-i Sabbah and the community he founded at Alamut over 900 years ago. The transformation of the Ismaili community from medieval warriors to modern global citizens is one of the most remarkable stories of religious adaptation in history. The same movement that once struck terror into the hearts of sultans and caliphs now runs hospitals, schools, and development programs across the world. The descendants of the fidais who gave their lives in assassination missions now work as doctors, engineers, teachers, and business leaders. The faith that was once practiced in secret, hidden from persecutors, is now openly celebrated in Ismaili centres around the globe. This transformation did not happen overnight. It was the result of centuries of gradual change, of adaptation to new circumstances, of reinterpretation of traditions in light of changing times. The Ismaili community has always been remarkably flexible, able to adjust its practices and expressions while maintaining its core beliefs. This flexibility, which was already evident in Hassan's time, has allowed the community to survive and thrive through dramatic historical changes. The ruins of Alamut Castle still stand in the Alborz mountains of northern Iran, a testament to the remarkable achievement of Hassan-i Sabbah and his followers. Visitors can climb the steep path to the summit, walk among the crumbling walls, and imagine what life was like in this remote fortress nearly 1,000 years ago. The setting remains as dramatic as ever, with jagged peaks rising all around and eagles circling overhead. It is easy to understand why Hassan chose this place, why he saw in these mountains a refuge where his community could survive and flourish. The other Ismaili fortresses have fared differently. Some, like Lamsa Castle, also in the Alborz mountains, have been partially restored and can be visited by tourists. Others have crumbled into ruins, their stones scattered across remote mountainsides. A few have disappeared entirely, their locations known only from historical records. But together they form a network of sites that trace the geography of the medieval Ismaili state, a state that existed for over a century and a half in the heart of hostile territory. The legacy of Hassan-i Sabbah extends far beyond the physical remains of his fortresses. His influence can be seen in the very language we use. The word assassin, now a common term in dozens of languages, derives from the name applied to his followers. Every time someone uses this word, they are unconsciously invoking the memory of Hassan and the movement he created. Few historical figures have left such a lasting mark on human vocabulary. The concept of targeted political killing, which Hassan systematized and refined, has had a long and troubling afterlife. Throughout history, various groups and governments have employed assassination as a political tool, sometimes explicitly citing the example of the medieval assassins. The ethical questions raised by Hassan's methods remain relevant today. When, if ever, is it justified to kill a political leader? Can targeted violence ever serve a legitimate cause? These questions have no easy answers, but they were first posed in their modern form by the activities of Hassan and his fidais. The legends that grew up around the assassins have had their own cultural impact. The story of the old man of the mountain with his garden of paradise and his drugged followers captured the imagination of Europeans for centuries. It appeared in countless books, plays, and later films. It influenced the development of secret society mythology in Western culture. The mysterious, all-powerful leader commanding fanatical followers became a stock figure in popular imagination, appearing in various forms from Gothic novels to spy thrillers. These legends, as we have noted, were largely inaccurate. The historical Hassan-i Sabbah was very different from the sinister figure of European fantasy. He was a scholar and theologian, not a drug-dealing manipulator. His followers were motivated by sincere religious belief, not by artificial visions of paradise. The real story of the assassins is more complex and more interesting than the legends, but the legends have proven remarkably persistent. Modern scholarship has done much to correct these misconceptions. Historians like Farhad Daftari have devoted their careers to recovering the authentic history of the Ismailis, separating fact from fiction, and presenting a more balanced picture of this remarkable community. Their work has revealed the Ismailis not as exotic fanatics, but as a sophisticated religious movement with a rich intellectual tradition. The library of Alamut, destroyed by the Mongols, contained treasures of philosophy, science and literature that rivaled the great collections of Baghdad and Cairo. The religious ideas that Hassan developed have also had lasting influence. His emphasis on the necessity of authoritative teaching, on the importance of a living guide to interpret religious truth, remains central to Nizari Ismaili belief. The current Aga Khan, like his predecessors, is regarded by Ismailis as the Imam, the divinely guided leader who provides authoritative guidance on matters of faith and practice. This concept of living guidance gives Ismailism a flexibility that allows it to adapt to changing times while maintaining continuity with its past. The organizational structures that Hassan created also left a lasting legacy. The hierarchical system of dais and other ranks, the networks of communication and coordination, the methods of recruitment and training, all these were innovations that influenced later organizations. Some historians have seen in the assassins a precursor to modern intelligence agencies, with their emphasis on information gathering, covert operations, and targeted action. Whether or not this comparison is entirely apt, it captures something important about the sophistication of Hassan's organization. The relationship between the Ismailis and the broader Islamic world has evolved significantly since Hassan's time. The fierce sectarian conflicts of the medieval period have largely subsided, while differences remain between Sunni and Shia Muslims, and between different Shia groups. The violent confrontations of the past have given way to more peaceful coexistence in most places. The Ismailis, once persecuted as dangerous heretics, are now generally accepted as part of the diverse family of Islamic communities. This acceptance has been facilitated by the changed circumstances of the modern world. The political structures that made the medieval conflict so intense, the rival caliphates and sultanates competing for religious and political authority, no longer exist. The nation-states that replace them operate on different principles, generally separating religious authority from political power. In this new environment, the old sectarian battles have lost much of their urgency. The Ismaili community has also actively worked to improve its relations with other Muslims and with the wider world. The Aga Khan and other Ismaili leaders have emphasized the values that Ismailis share with other Muslims and with people of all faiths. They have promoted interfaith dialogue, charitable work, and cultural preservation. The Aga Khan Trust for Culture, for example, has restored historic mosques, gardens, and other sites across the Islamic world, benefiting communities of all backgrounds. The story of Hassan-i Sabbah and the assassins has also entered popular culture in new ways in recent decades. The video game series Assassin's Creed, which has sold millions of copies worldwide, draws heavily on the history and legends of the medieval assassins. While the games take considerable liberties with historical accuracy, they have introduced a new generation to the basic outlines of the assassin story. For many young people, Hassan-i Sabbah and Alamut are familiar names, even if their knowledge comes from entertainment rather than history books. This popular interest has both benefits and drawbacks. On one hand, it keeps the memory of the assassins alive and may inspire some people to learn more about the actual history. On the other hand, it can reinforce misconceptions and stereotypes, presenting the Ismailis as exotic villains rather than as a complex religious community with a rich heritage. The challenge for educators and historians is to channel this popular interest toward a more accurate and nuanced understanding. The physical legacy of the assassins continues to attract visitors and scholars. Archaeological work at Alamut and other sites has revealed new information about how the Ismailis lived, what they ate, how they organized their communities. These discoveries have helped to humanize the assassins, showing them not as mysterious fanatics, but as ordinary people living extraordinary lives in extraordinary circumstances. The intellectual legacy of the Ismailis is also being recovered and appreciated. Scholars have edited and published Ismaili texts that survived the destruction of Alamut, revealing a sophisticated philosophical and theological tradition. These texts show that the Ismailis were not merely warriors and assassins, but also thinkers and scholars who engaged seriously with the great intellectual questions of their time. The library of Alamut may be gone, but fragments of its contents survive in manuscripts preserved in other collections. The story of Hassan-i Sabbah also raises enduring questions about the nature of religious commitment, political violence, and the relationship between faith and power. Hassan was a man of deep conviction who believed he was serving God and truth. He was also a man who ordered the deaths of hundreds of people and created an organization dedicated to political murder. How do we reconcile these aspects of his character? Can sincere religious belief justify violence? These questions have no easy answers, but they are worth pondering as we reflect on Hassan's life and legacy. Perhaps the most important lesson of Hassan's story is the power of determination and organization. Hassan started with nothing, a convert to a minority faith in a hostile empire. Through sheer force of will, combined with strategic genius and organizational skill, he built a state that defied the mightiest powers of his age. He showed that a small committed group could achieve remarkable things against overwhelming odds. This lesson has inspired both admiration and imitation over the centuries, not always for good purposes. The Nizari Ismaili community today numbers in the millions, spread across more than 25 countries on every inhabited continent. They are united by their allegiance to the Aga Khan and by their shared heritage, a heritage that stretches back through the centuries, to Hassan-i Sabbah and the fortress of Alamut. They remember Hassan not as a terrorist or a fanatic, but as a founder and a saint, a man who preserved their faith through times of persecution and laid the foundations for their community's survival. For the rest of the world, Hassan-i Sabbah remains a figure of fascination and controversy. He was undoubtedly one of the most remarkable individuals of the medieval period, a man who changed history through the force of his personality and the power of his ideas. Whether we admire him or condemn him, we cannot ignore him. His story is part of our common human heritage, a reminder of what individuals can achieve and of the complex moral questions that such achievements can raise. The mountains of northern Iran still stand, as they have for millions of years. The eagles still circle above the peaks. The ruins of Alamut still cling to their rocky outcrop, battered by time and weather, but not entirely erased. And the memory of Hassan-i Sabbah, the old man of the mountain, still echoes through history, a voice from the past that continues to speak to the present. No historical figure has been more misunderstood than Hassan-i Sabbah. The legends that grew up around him and his followers have obscured the reality of who he was and what he achieved. To fully appreciate Hassan's story, we must examine these myths and separate fact from fiction. The most famous legend about the assassins concerns the use of hashish. According to this story, Hassan and his successors used the drug to manipulate their followers, giving them visions of paradise that motivated them to sacrifice their lives. This legend was popularized by Marco Polo, who claimed to have heard it during his travels through the region in the late 13th century. Marco Polo's account is vivid and detailed. He described a beautiful garden hidden in the mountains, filled with every pleasure imaginable. Young men would be drugged and brought to this garden, where they would enjoy its delights. Then they would be drugged again and removed. When they awoke, they would be told that they had been given a glimpse of paradise, and that they could return there permanently if they died in service to the old man of the mountain. This story captured the imagination of Europeans and has been repeated countless times over the centuries. It appears in countless books, articles, and now websites. It has shaped popular understanding of the assassins more than any other single account, but there is very little evidence that it is true. Modern historians are deeply skeptical of the hashish legend. There is no mention of hashish use in any Ismaili sources. The Ismailis themselves, who preserved detailed accounts of their history and beliefs, never described anything like the Garden of Paradise that Marco Polo described. The legend appears to have originated with the enemies of the Ismailis, who spread it as propaganda to discredit the movement. The term hashishin, from which the word assassin derives, may not have referred to hashish use at all. Some scholars believe it was simply a term of abuse, implying that the Ismailis were lowlifes or social outcasts. Others suggest it referred to their ascetic lifestyle, living on simple herbs and plants. The true etymology remains uncertain, but the connection to drug use is probably a later invention. The motivation of the Fidais was not artificial visions induced by drugs, but sincere religious belief. They genuinely believed that they were serving God and the Imam, that their actions were righteous, and that paradise awaited them after death. This made them far more formidable than any drug-induced fanatic could be. They were intelligent, patient, and utterly committed to their cause. Another common misconception concerns the nature of the Ismaili state. Popular accounts often portray the assassins as a secret society or a terrorist organization, operating in the shadows without any territorial base. In reality, the Nizari Ismailis controlled a substantial territory, including numerous fortresses and the villages and valleys that surrounded them. They had a functioning government, collected taxes, administered justice, and provided services to their population. They were a state, not merely a conspiracy. The Ismaili state was unusual in its geography, consisting of scattered mountain strongholds rather than a contiguous territory. But this was a practical adaptation to their circumstances, not evidence of some sinister nature. The mountains provided natural defences that allowed the Ismailis to survive against much more powerful enemies. The fortress network, stretching from Persia to Syria, was a remarkable achievement of military engineering and political organisation. The portrayal of Hassan-i Sabbah as a sinister manipulator is also misleading. Hassan was certainly a formidable and sometimes ruthless leader. He ordered assassinations and demanded absolute obedience from his followers. But he was also a scholar and thinker, a man who valued learning and built one of the great libraries of the medieval world. He lived simply and held himself to the same strict standards he imposed on others. He was a complex figure who defies easy categorization. The religious beliefs of the Ismailis have also been widely misunderstood. They were not, as some accounts suggest, a cult of death worshippers or nihilists. They were Muslims who followed a particular interpretation of Islam, one that emphasized the importance of the Imam and the hidden meanings of religious texts. Their beliefs were sophisticated and carefully reasoned, drawing on centuries of Islamic philosophical and theological development. The Ismaili emphasis on esoteric knowledge has sometimes been interpreted as evidence of secret, sinister teachings. In reality, the distinction between outer and inner meanings was a common feature of medieval Islamic thought, not unique to the Ismailis. Many Sufi orders and philosophical schools made similar distinctions. The Ismailis developed this approach more systematically than some others, but they were working within a broader intellectual tradition. The relationship between the Ismailis and the Crusaders has also been subject to misunderstanding. Some accounts portray them as allies united against their common Muslim enemies. Others present them as implacable foes. The reality was more complex. The Syrian Ismailis, like other powers in the region, pursued their own interests, sometimes cooperating with Crusaders and sometimes opposing them. They were pragmatic actors in a complicated political environment, not ideological allies or enemies of any particular group. The legend of the assassins has had a long afterlife in Western culture. It has appeared in countless novels, plays, films, and now video games. Each retelling has added new layers of myth and fantasy, moving further from the historical reality. The assassins of popular culture are often portrayed as a secret society with supernatural powers, able to appear and disappear at will, bound by mysterious rituals and codes. This image owes more to fiction than to history. The persistence of these myths reflects something about Western attitudes toward the Islamic world. The assassins became a symbol of Eastern mystery and menace, a projection of European fears and fantasies. They were exotic, dangerous, and utterly alien, everything that the familiar world of Christendom was not. This Orientalist framing has shaped perceptions of the assassins for centuries and continues to influence popular culture today. Correcting these misconceptions is important not just for historical accuracy, but for contemporary understanding. The myths about the assassins have sometimes been used to justify negative stereotypes about Muslims in general, portraying them as fanatical, violent, and irrational. A more accurate understanding of the Ismailis reveals a community that was sophisticated, adaptable, and motivated by sincere religious conviction, qualities that deserve respect even from those who disagree with their methods. The real story of Hassan-i Sabbah and the assassins is more interesting than the legends. It is a story of religious devotion and political innovation, of survival against overwhelming odds, of intellectual achievement and military prowess. It is a story that deserves to be told accurately, freed from the distortions of centuries of myth-making. Where does Hassan-i Sabbah stand in the broader sweep of world history? How should we assess his achievements and his legacy? These are questions that historians and others have debated for centuries, and they have no simple answers. By any measure, Hassan was one of the most remarkable individuals of the medieval period. From humble beginnings, he rose to challenge the mightiest powers of his age. He created a state that survived for over a century and a half, outlasting the Seljuk Empire that had tried to destroy it. He developed new methods of political action that influenced the course of history. He built institutions that preserved and transmitted knowledge across generations. Few people in any era have achieved so much. Hassan's military innovations were particularly significant. The systematic use of assassination as a political tool was not entirely new, but Hassan refined and institutionalized it in ways that had never been done before. He showed that a small, determined group could challenge much larger powers by striking at their leadership. This lesson has been learned and applied by many groups since, not always for good purposes. The organizational structures that Hassan created were equally impressive. The network of fortresses, the hierarchy of dais and fidais, the systems of communication and coordination, all these represented a high level of sophistication for their time. Hassan built an organization that could function effectively across vast distances, maintain security against infiltration, and pursue long-term goals with patience and persistence. These are achievements that any modern organization would envy. Hassan's intellectual contributions are often overlooked but were substantial. He developed a distinctive theological system that addressed fundamental questions about religious authority and knowledge. He built a library that was renowned throughout the Islamic world. He attracted scholars and thinkers to his remote mountain fortress, creating a center of learning in an unlikely location. The destruction of this library by the Mongols was a tragedy for human knowledge. But Hassan's legacy is also deeply troubling. The assassinations he ordered caused immense suffering. Hundreds of people were killed, many of them guilty of nothing more than opposing the Ismaili cause or holding positions of authority in enemy governments. The families of these victims were left to grieve, the political systems they served were disrupted, and a climate of fear and suspicion poisoned public life across the Middle East. The ethical questions raised by Hassan's methods remain relevant today. Can political violence ever be justified? Are there circumstances in which killing a leader is the right thing to do? These questions have no easy answers, and thoughtful people have disagreed about them for centuries. Hassan clearly believed that his actions were justified, that he was serving God and truth by eliminating the enemies of the faith. But many others, then and now, have found his methods abhorrent. The strict discipline of Hassan's community also raises concerns. The demand for absolute obedience, the harsh punishments for deviation, the execution of his own sons for alleged violations of the law, all these suggest a system that left little room for individual conscience or dissent. Hassan created an effective organization, but it was also an authoritarian one, in which the leader's word was law and questioning was not tolerated. These troubling aspects of Hassan's legacy should not be ignored or minimized. He was a man of his time, operating in a violent and unforgiving world, but he also made choices that contributed to that violence. A balanced assessment of his life must acknowledge both his achievements and his crimes. Perhaps the most useful way to think about Hassan is as a revolutionary. He sought to overturn the existing order and replace it with something new. He believed that the powers that ruled the Islamic world were illegitimate, that they had usurped authority that rightfully belonged to the Imam. He was willing to use any means necessary to advance his cause, including violence. In this he resembles other revolutionary figures throughout history, from ancient times to the present. Revolutions are always controversial. They disrupt established patterns, challenge vested interests, and often involve violence. Those who benefit from the existing order tend to condemn revolutionaries as criminals and fanatics. Those who suffer under the existing order may see them as liberators and heroes. Hassan has been viewed both ways, depending on the perspective of the observer. For the Nizari Ismailis, Hassan remains a revered figure, the founder of their community and a saint of their faith. They remember him as a man of deep piety and learning, who preserved their tradition through times of persecution and laid the foundations for their survival. Whatever his faults, he gave them a home and a hope, and they honour his memory for that. For many others, Hassan remains a troubling figure, a man who institutionalized political murder and created an organization dedicated to spreading fear. They see in him a precursor to modern terrorism, a reminder of the dangers of religious fanaticism. Whatever his achievements, they cannot overlook the blood on his hands. Both perspectives capture something true about Hassan-i Sabbah. He was a man of contradictions, a scholar who ordered killings, a builder who destroyed, a believer who inspired both devotion and terror. He does not fit neatly into categories of hero or villain, saint or sinner. He was a complex human being who lived a remarkable life in remarkable times. The world that Hassan knew has long since passed away. The Seljuk Empire fell, the Crusader states were expelled from the Holy Land, the Mongols rose and declined, new powers emerged and faded in their turn. The political and religious conflicts that shaped Hassan's life have been transformed beyond recognition. The fortresses he built are ruins, the books he collected are ashes, the people he knew are dust. But something of Hassan survives. His name is remembered, his story is told, his legacy continues to influence the world. The Nizari Ismaili community that he founded still exists, transformed but unbroken, carrying forward the tradition he established. The word assassin that derives from his followers is spoken in languages around the world. The questions he raised about faith, power and violence remain as urgent as ever. In the end, perhaps the most important thing about Hassan-i Sabbah is simply that he existed. He showed what one determined individual could accomplish against overwhelming odds. He demonstrated that the course of history is not fixed, that small groups can challenge great powers, that ideas can be more powerful than armies. Whether we admire him or condemn him, we cannot deny his impact on the world.